Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this panel discussion to explore the benefits of harnessing data in this rapidly evolving technology landscape. Think AI, generative AI, digital assets, and how the UK can become a world leader in digital innovation whilst also recognizing the need to protect against cyber, legal, regulatory, ethical, and other risks. I'm delighted to introduce our esteemed panel of speakers. So starting from my right, Raj Paranandi has been Chief Operating Officer EMEA and APAC at MarketAxess since March 2021, and previous to that held a variety of technology and operational leadership roles across a number of large global organizations. Anthony Day is a partner at DLA Piper and has experience of some of the most complex and business-critical IT, technology-driven and outsourcing projects globally. Maria Axente is leading PwC's Responsible AI, managing the company's efforts in deploying responsible and ethical AI and data across the UK business, its operations and clients. Maria is also chair of Tech UK Data and AI Leadership Committee. Adam Afriyie MP has been chairman of the all-party parliamentary group on FinTech since 2015. He was first elected as Member of Parliament for Windsor in 2005 and served as Shadow Minister for Science and Innovation from 2007 to 2010. Right, let's kick off our discussion. Raj, if I can start with you, please. There's been a huge amount of discussion recently about generative AI, not least with the Prime Minister recently setting out his vision for the UK to be a world leader in AI regulation. But what are the commercial opportunities that AI presents in terms of improving our ability to deliver better outcomes for customers?
Yeah, well, first of all, good afternoon. Thanks for having me. I mean, one of the things so I work for MarketAxess, which is one of the world's largest bond trading platforms. One of the things that we talk about a lot internally is that technology should never be seen as a panacea in and of itself. So I always try and think in terms of the job that needs to be done. And so in our case, the job that we were trying to do is to take a bond market that traditionally was heavily intermediated over the phone, so transactions happen through the telephone, and bring it to an electronic platform. And having done that, what we thought about was how we provided insights to customers that they wouldn't have without all of the data that we can provide. And so, for example, we're able to offer customers insights into the likely price at which a bond will trade, which sounds very simplistic in many markets, but in a very illiquid market like bonds had never really been available. We're now able to look at the correlations between different types of bonds. So if you're not able to find liquidity in bond A, is there something that shares many of its characteristics? We're able to give customers insight into the likely impact upon their execution outcome if they trade in the morning versus the afternoon, the likely counterparty with whom they're able to find liquidity, and interestingly, all of the data that was required to generate these insights has been there for many years. It's been there for as long as I've been in the industry. But historically, the computational horsepower to get at the data was simply not available. And I think a combination of not just AI, but AI, machine learning, and cloud computing has put us in a situation now where we can get at that data and we can interpolate billions of data points to give customers very valuable insights that they didn't have before. And so, if you're a bit of a geek like I am, that's a really exciting prospect. We're able to give customers a set of data to drive them to something that represents fundamentally a better outcome.
Fantastic. So plenty of opportunities there. So Anthony, we've just heard about some of those opportunities and applications that AI can have and how we can harness them. But what concerns do you have about the legal or regulatory challenges that AI presents?
Yeah, so it's a very exciting time and a very exciting area at the moment. At DLA, I have two primary roles. One is a global role, head of our technology and sourcing team, and then another role is our UK financial services sector head. So I'll sort of give some perspectives for UK, but also sort of looking more globally as well. In terms of the legal and regulatory risks at the moment, we're in a sort of a situation where there's existing regulation that applies to sort of digital data and AI-driven solutions. Primarily, that's kind of sort of data protection and privacy-related legislation, obviously EU GDPR, UK GDPR. And then also this sort of the regulated outsourcing and financial services and cloud regime that applies to sort of leveraging particularly sort of third-party AI solutions. So there's already a kind of a range of different regulatory regimes that apply at the moment. There's also the kind of the operational resilience regimes that apply. But if we look kind of forwards over the next couple of years or so, we're seeing this wave of new regulation coming, and some of it is a little bit of a backlash to just the kind of the explosion that we've seen, particularly in generative AI. So the sort of the ChatGPT effect. And different regulators are taking different approaches. So if we sort of compare and contrast a little bit between the UK and the EU, in the EU, they're taking very much a kind of a sort of a horizontal regulatory approach where there's going to be the new EU AI Act, which will be coming in the next kind of 2, possibly 3 years, depending on how quickly it goes through the legislative process. The UK is taking quite a different approach where it's effectively allowing the sort of sectoral regulators for the different sectors to be able to kind of promote legislation that's relevant for that sector. So there's benefits with each approach. I think one thing for businesses that are operating kind of more internationally is just how you kind of balance between different regulatory approaches across different regimes, and do you end up having to go with this kind of sort of high watermark approach of just following the EU AI Act as the kind of the sort of the core central plank of regulation? So there's definitely a lot of regulatory change coming, and businesses are thinking about, okay, well, how do we build the right kind of governance frameworks? How do we look at how we sort of optimize processes within our business to take account of that? The other thing that I would also mention, which people often forget about, is absent some of the regulatory change that's happening, there's actually a lot you can do just contractually when you're contracting for these solutions as well. So a sort of pitfall for many to be aware, we've seen a lot of financial institutions that have used third-party AI solutions. The most exciting thing with these AI solutions is actually the kind of the learnings to the algorithms, the learnings to the model. You don't usually own that. That stays with the platform provider. And unless you put contractual restrictions around how the platform provider or the AI solution provider might then go and use all of the learnings from your business with your direct competitors, they potentially can do. And we've seen many organizations kind of come unstuck because they've had AI solutions roaming over huge amounts of data sets and then suddenly finding that their secret sauce is being pivoted and used with a direct competitor, and obviously creates antitrust competition concerns as well, but something that can actually be fixed quite easily contractually.
Thanks, Anthony. So I think we can all see it's quite a complex regulatory landscape to navigate, especially if you're operating globally, and you know, AI tends to be global rather than specific to a jurisdiction. But in addition to these regulatory challenges, Maria, what ethical considerations do you believe need to be taken into account as AI use becomes more commonplace in commercial settings?
That's a very good question, but before I'm able to answer this, I think it's worth asking the question, but what does ethics means in the context of AI, and why do we need to leverage the field of ethics and applied ethics? And it was probably as early as 2013 where data scientists and engineers came together with philosophers to explore what will be the potential implication of using a technology that has agency, that adapts to external environment, that's autonomous to a certain degree, and what sort of a disruption it will bring to enterprises that usually operate based on a more linear approach. You know, all our processes are linear in nature because the technology we've used before was more deterministic in nature. We didn't have to deal with something that has a life of its own. And suddenly out of this, we started seeing trends or themes that they were grouped into principles, ethical principles like fairness, explainability, robustness, safety and security, human in control. And those principles have then started to be issued by technology companies that have been at the forefront of the AI revolution, and gradually they've been adopted by other types of organizations, so much so that you've seen OECD and UNESCO drafting those principles, which ended up being leveraged by our own government in the AI regulation framework, then added to the AI Act as a way of organizing the governance. The US has an AI Bill of Rights. And what this tells us is that we need to, when we're looking at ethical consideration and who benefits, who loses, who is harmed, or what are the big risks, we need to approach it holistically. Regulation will be a set of rules that will allow us to govern AI, but then it has to be doubled by soft regulation and different type of instruments and intervention. And this is where each organization looking to use AI, as Anthony was saying, has now a responsibility to learn how to govern, leveraging existing tools from policy to frameworks to cultivating ethical behavior, incentivizing data scientists to look at those ethical implications, using impact assessment, but also being able to complement that with AI assurance techniques. Our government, again, has been looking to foster AI assurance that will seek validating and verifying algorithms, technical standards that will complement wherever regulation will stop to be effective. So being able to look at all the different ways of, or ethical challenges and dilemma across the life cycle and being able to effectively address that. And when it comes to what is wrong and what is right, I think that's where we see, again, a different level of complexity, because we operate based on different value system. And what's fair for us and for you might not be fair for the people attending a different conference. What was fair when we created the A-level algorithm that predicted the grades of our children a few years ago, was that ethical, was that legal? Remained for us to discuss and surface all those issues, because operating with different value system and having a set of key ethical principles doesn't solve the problem. When you are an engineer and you are tasked to answer the question, but what's fair, and fair for whom, and fair and who benefits and who loses, knowing that the chatbot can easily be deployed in a health context or for TfL or whatever use case you see this complexity emerging that is above and beyond regulation. And businesses like ours have a responsibility to be able to figure this out and then being able to find ways to navigate complexity, because technology adoption is ever increasing, and we need to remain in control of this technology. And more likely you've seen the debate about AI ethics and AI safety with a number of very prominent AI pioneers warning us about existential threat. I think that at the end of the day, what's really important for us is to recognize there are risks and harm attached, and we need to work collectively to address it. And having this balanced approach of balancing benefits with risk is the common sense way to look into AI.
Right, well, fascinating area to work in for sure. And let's hope alongside the development of AI technologies, we also see those safety and fairness features being built in along the way. But let's take a look at the government's view to this. So Adam, what steps do you believe the government needs to take to manage those benefits that AI presents in a responsible and ethical way?
I think I'm minded, I think it was of what Ronald Reagan said, which is the 9 most terrifying words in history are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And I think that, when it comes to this space, it's really important that the government doesn't dictate the direction of travel, nor dictate what innovation should take place. And I have to say that governments and politicians like myself can move at a glacial speed. But in this scenario, when it comes to AI, the benefits and financial technology, I have to say that the Prime Minister, the government are, they're aerodynamic. I mean, they're moving incredibly fast. And I've been around almost 20 years now in the front line of politics, and the government is moving incredibly quickly in this area. And I think that their approach is the right approach. I don't agree with every aspect of it, but is the right approach in laying out, first of all, the principles by which the actions of market players will be judged. And I think that what that does, if you take those 5 core principles in the pro-innovation AI white paper, it means that each individual business can sit down with their lawyers and say, right, we've at least got to think about these 5 areas. Is it safe in the way we're operating? What are the risks associated with it? Is it fair? Obviously, fair is a difficult word to define. Actually, is there contestability? If there is a negative outcome, either for a consumer or even to do with freedom of speech, is there a mechanism by which our customers or our users can contest it? And is it open and transparent as necessary so that the AI can be understood by customers? So I think the approach is the right one. My biggest fear was actually that the government would move too quickly in terms of defining precise outcomes and defining precise areas. And I think we've got a really good opportunity with the European legislation, which does seek to have an AI Act, which sends a shudder down my spine, compared to our approach, which is, if I can put it this way, it's quintessentially British. It's pragmatic, it responds, it adapts. It's all a bit messy, but provided the principles are held to, then I think we're in a very good place in the United Kingdom to see the UK at the forefront of AI. The last thing I'll say is that not only is the government aerodynamic in this regard, but I would also say that they are putting their money where their mouth is. And you've got about over 100 million for the Global Talent Network. You've got about 900 million now for the research resource, i.e. a supercomputer to help process AI data, and then about 100 million for the tech missions, kind of innovative schemes. So the government is putting its money where its mouth is, but it's not controlling and determining the outcome.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that. So alongside AI, the availability and use of data is also driving significant change across our economy and society. So what do you think firms can do to foster growth and innovation in both AI and data-led sectors to make the UK a world leader in this space? And if I can come to you first, please, Raj.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the answer is always education. And one of the things that I've noticed recently that's been amusing me is that when people talk about AI, they often mean very, very different things. So, for example, if I think about the application of technology to data, there's a continuum, and at the simple end of that continuum, there's effectively taking some data in a fairly linear fashion and drawing some conclusions, which in my head is what programmers back in the day called business rules. In the middle of the continuum, there's taking data and recognizing patterns within it, and then at the far right end of the continuum, there is all of the stuff that captures the modern zeitgeist around generative AI and deep learning models and so on. And when I hear people talk about AI, there's a lot of conflation of all of those things. So one of the big things that we're focusing on internally, for example, is an education process so that people understand the differences between the various points on the continuum, and also the perimeter of where the ethical dilemma begins, because it's certainly not at the left-hand side of the continuum. People have been doing that with computers for years. The second thing that I feel very passionately about is encouraging, what I call quantitative curiosity amongst younger people. So I was talking to our new graduate intake recently, and they were asking what I thought they should do to position themselves best for their future careers. And my answer was, read everything on these topics. Take every quantitative course that you can at school or university. Learn to code. I spent 20 years or so on trading floors. And in 10 years' time, there won't be a single person on a trading floor that doesn't have the ability to code at least. And I think that's something that we need to drive through the training curriculum that we operate within firms, but also through the education sector as well.
Thank you very much, Raj. And Anthony, anything you'd add? What can firms do to foster this innovation and growth?
Yeah, so for me, there's sort of 3 essential ingredients that help with fostering this innovation and growth. First is access to capital. Second is having the right kind of talent or community of innovation so that you're getting those ideas. And then the third piece is a kind of a progressive regulatory environment that supports that. So it's really encouraging actually to hear from Adam around the steps that UK government are doing in terms of putting more funding into it, taking quite a progressive regulatory approach, particularly into AI. And if I maybe think about, say, a sort of a parallel area in terms of, say, the success that we've had in FinTech in the UK, again, that was probably a combination of those three different elements coming together. So there was access to capital, particularly there was a lot of kind of UK, European private equity, venture funds, private capital that came in that was particularly focusing on that market and less having to rely on US capital. And at the moment, particularly in the AI space, it's more West Coast driven, big tech firm driven, West Coast capital. So I think there's more that we can do from a sort of European and UK financial services perspective for access to capital for AI innovation. The progressive regulatory environment within FinTech was all about having sandbox regimes and kind of fostering that culture of innovation. So again, I think if we can do more of that within the AI space, that's naturally going to lead to more adoption. There are obviously challenges in terms of when you're operating across multiple countries and multiple markets and differing levels of regulation, but still having a progressive approach means that you might be able to do more exciting innovation within the UK, etc. And I think it's actually once you get those kind of sort of progressive regulatory and capital cultures to coming together, and there's the education, actually that's when you create your sort of thriving ecosystem. And the lawyers and the advisors and others all have to kind of play a part in that and kind of get behind that ecosystem to make it thriving. So for me, it's sort of those three elements coming together, and I think we've got great success stories in sort of adjacent areas, and then it's just applying it to this sort of data, digital AI innovation area.
So lots of lessons we can take from other areas. Thank you very much, Anthony. Anything to add, Maria?
The skills and the talent is critical because we know that we have a shortage of talent in technology in general. And we know that government has invested heavily in fostering more skills in AI. But I think that at the end of the day, is what I said earlier, is about recognizing the disruption AI brings. And our chairman, Kevin Ellis, speaks about being the disruptor, not the disrupted. Why? Is because we are faced with a technology that is going to change forever who we are as individuals and a society. And we need to be able to manage that disruption and understanding what happens when you go for some use cases as an organization, and what will be the ripple effect when you use ChatGPT interacting with your clients, or to summarize contracts, or to create or generate new content if you're a creative. And understanding and managing that disruption will guarantee that whatever happens in external environment in terms of policies or regulation or expectation from your customers will be well understood and managed internally. And yes, it's tantalizing to think about yet another transformation, digital data transformation. But I think starting in a journey that makes sense for who you are, going for low-hanging fruit, planning ahead, will allow us to pace ourselves and being able to recognize step by step what do we need to have in place to be able to reap the benefits of AI, being able to be on top of the risk, being able to align ourselves with different regulatory expectation. But also keep in mind that we are seeing a more and more educated civil society, consumer, who will come and ask for the algorithms to be fairer, more transparent. And that there are different set of incentives that businesses will have to deal with. That's on top of everything else, remaining competitive in the current economic climate. So how do you manage all those conflicting priorities? And really, instead of being either terrified or too excited about AI, find the middle path that will allow you to recognize its limitation, but also its great potential, and being able to work, as Anthony said, in ecosystem. And we haven't had to do this before, because previously, iteration of technology, you build in the house, consume it in the house. Now AI is consuming an ecosystem. You're part of a supply chain, and you rely on the big, the owners of large language models to do a good job before you provide services to your clients. And understanding all this complexity and being able, again, to manage it, I would think it's the fundamental one thing that every company we'll need to do, and we'll need to do fast.
And just to build on that, there's actually a question that's come through on the app where someone has asked, are British schools and universities doing enough to equip students with the skills that employers will need now and in the future? So I don't know if anyone wants to take that quickfire. Maybe you, Raj, because you're focused on education.
I'm strongly encouraged when I meet the latest generation of graduates. I mean, their technical fluency and general literacy is way, way beyond what would have been the case, 10 or 15 years ago. So I think people are trying their best. But one of the things I certainly see is that technology becomes, obsolete almost as soon as people learn it nowadays. So there's a need, I think, for a constant, refresh. But I think people are trying their best. I think Anthony's points are well made about ensuring there's sufficient capital to support that ecosystem in terms of the ongoing training need.
Great. And Adam, more broadly, what do you think can be done from a policy, legislative and regulatory perspective to drive digital innovation and develop the UK into a global FinTech hub?
I'll be slightly controversial. I actually don't like the word drive. I don't like the word, the concept that the government will drive something. It never appeals to me. I think it's always better, and this is why I'm quite pleased with the policy that we have at the moment, is it's better just to enable things to happen, to allow things to happen. If I look around this audience, every single one of us has a similar set of hopes, desires. We all want to make a living. If you're an entrepreneur, you're desperate to make a profit. So I would say that, that provided the regulatory environment enables those human drivers to come through, then actually the market will, there aren't any antitrust problems, then I think actually that is what will lift all the boats. That is what will make the industry thrive. If for 3 or 4 companies are in competition for a particular type of AI deployment, maybe it's in global satellite positioning systems, then all of a sudden the price comes down to consumers. So I think I'm not comfortable with the government driving this. I'm more comfortable with the government enabling and recognising that it's the market, it's entrepreneurs, it's investors that actually create the change. The final thing I would say is that FinTech is, we've already mentioned it, but FinTech, I chair the FinTech All-Party Parliamentary Group, is a great example of where the government did the right thing. Bit sluggish in the early days of even looking at it or getting involved. The minute it started to move to create those sandboxes in the FCA, which are world-renowned, everyone looks at the FCA to see what we're doing here in the UK. And I think a similar approach, if we adopt a similar approach when it comes to AI and its deployment both in business, industry, and possibly even in education and healthcare, then I think we'll be in a solid position. So I think the government should carry on with the same thing, but in our typical British way, when a problem arises, either with ethics in a particular field or with safety or cybersecurity in another field, then we need to be able to respond very quickly and to act very quickly according to a framework, and I hope that people like Maria will be feeding into that framework.
Thank you. So before we move to questions from the audience and I have a look at what's come through on the app here, maybe we can do a quick fire round, and if I can ask each of you to give me one tip or piece of advice to firms in the immediate term, how they engage with AI solutions in the absence of a very clear, firm regulatory, and legal framework. So if we can move down the line, and I'll have a look what's coming through the app in the meantime. Please get your questions ready.
It's probably slightly repeating what I said before. Start with a tangible use case that makes someone's life better and work backwards into the technology. Like oftentimes I see people want to experiment with technology for the sake of it without really understanding the business objective or the end outcome that they're trying to get to. So I feel very strongly that if you've got a use case, something you're trying to simplify, something in the world that you're trying to make better, that's always a very good starting point for this kind of innovation.
Absolutely. And to the earlier point in one of the previous panels around, you need people to understand how this will make their life better. Yeah. Yes. And as you say, if you start with that solid use case, it's much easier to do that. Anthony?
Yeah, so for me, I think with this wave of AI regulation coming, dealing with reg change is never easy, particularly for sort of larger financial services organisations. So actually just get started now. You don't have to sort of fix the world in a day. You can just deal with particular use cases. You can start to build incremental controls but just trying to sort of proactively work on it and focus on it with the business, so that actually when a lot of the regulation does come in, you're just a little bit more prepared, a little bit more ahead of the curve. And actually, you'll find that you're more transparent to consumers and customers, you can build trust, you'll have competitive advantage because you'll be kind of leveraging these solutions earlier. So for me, it's just kind of embrace it now, but sort of get stuck into some of the regulatory and legal challenges that also throws up.
Fantastic.
That's
Maria?
amazing. Common sense, apply common sense. As Raj and Anthony said, look for the low-hanging fruit, but also plan for the future, both tomorrow, but years to come, and being able to bring people on a journey. I think it's really, really important for us to bring everyone on this journey, looking at how we engage our employees when we digitize operation, how we look for feedback from places where otherwise we wouldn't have looked at. Because if this AI tends to be a revolution, we all need to reap the benefits. And the only way to do this is to challenge ourselves to be more transparent, but also think of the voices that otherwise you wouldn't have engaged. And if we do this, common sense, a bit of planning, and engage different voices, I think we'll be in a far better position, even in the next few months.
Okay, so look for that low-hanging fruit now, but also plan for the future strategically. Thank you. And Adam?
Yeah, well, I think Raj hit the nail on the head. From a business perspective, don't get distracted with all this stuff. What's the problem you're trying to solve? What's the market you're trying to crack? What's the product you're trying to, to innovate? Just focus on that. And then my one tip would be look at those 5 principles in the pro-innovation, pro-innovation white paper, and just check against it. And if you're a small firm, you've only got 5 or 10 staff, it doesn't take long. Take you a couple of hours to go through and work out on each of those principles, are you adhering to them, or have you at least thought about them? And then when it comes to the bigger firms, then you go to people like like Anthony, spend a fortune and make sure you've got it hook, line and sinker.
And what that will do is that you have 5 ethical principles.
Absolutely.
That will allow you to be both ethical and compliant with the legal framework that's coming.
And I think it'll also be quite refreshing. It's a really interesting intellectual exercise to say, this product that I'm creating, let's have a think about safety, let's have a think about security, let's have a think about, do people need to know how it works, the process? It's actually a fascinating intellectual exercise, particularly for an entrepreneur thinking about a new market.
Absolutely. So thank you very much for that. That concludes our sort of more structured questions, but let's now open it up to the audience. Anybody have any questions? And if you could just tell us where you're from and if you have a particular panel member you'd like to answer the question, please.
Hello, my name's Valerie. I'm a business owner of Swallows Connections, helping companies to expand and grow into Southeast Asia and into the UK markets. Thank you, Maria, for your very honest sharing about common sense. I resonate a lot with you on common sense because since COVID, the schools, the education system has been using a lot of digital technologies for the students, including learning classes. And I find that, the teachers and the education system is actually relying on data and digitalization to assess the students, such as what you mentioned about A-levels. My son is a classic example. He came into the UK 5 years ago. He was behind the normal standard, but he picked up along the way. And when he was supposed to go to get into the secondary education, he was put onto the bottom set. He worked his way up, but he couldn't. He will never be able to get into the top set. Currently, he is in year 9, and I sent him for private tuition, and he can do A-level subjects. But in the class, they still use data to assess him because he was already in the mid set, and he will never be able to get to the top set. And I'm asking the teachers about this, and he said this is the system, because majority of students are in combined science, because right now they are doing the options. Majority, they put them in combined science, because that's the easier way out. you get students to do better in the easier subjects. But my son is able to do the pure science subjects. He wants to be an architect. He has aspirations. But I find that our education system here is applying a lot because of the systems, not because of common sense. I'm not sure, are we addressing this in this country? Thank you.
Well, I mean, look, it's an interesting question, and one of the things that I worry about a little bit, coming back to the point about the ethics of AI and computation around it, is we need to make sure that the data set that's being used to generate a conclusion doesn't have an inherent bias associated with it. And the example that you mentioned seems indicative of one where maybe the data set is biased. So I think that is something that we need to think about as part of the ethical debate. How do we make sure that there's not an inherent lean to the data as an input? And then secondly, how do we make sure that the mathematics that underlie the model, right? So the things that drive the conclusion are auditable in some way, so that people can be clear on how the conclusion was reached. So I think it's quite a big field. There was an interesting use case I read about recently. I think it was at Mount Sinai in the US, the hospital, where essentially a hospital's suite of data was fed into a deep learning kind of machine, and the machine concluded that it could effectively predict when people were likely to exhibit symptoms of dementia, and pretty accurately. The problem was that nobody could explain how the model worked, and so doctors were then left with this ethical conundrum of whether they should pre-notify certain patients that they had a higher risk of dementia when, as a consequence of any follow-ups, they'd have to say, well, we don't really know how the conclusion was reached. The model generated the conclusion, but without any verifiable mathematics that we can look at. And so I think this is a very, very interesting domain, and Maria, probably something you worry about a lot, right? So.
Thank you for sharing the question first. I think that's one of the areas that we need to pay more attention, how much we delegate to technology before we preserve the human factor in the loop, and what are the moments that matter which we will not want to digitize going forward. And I think that's the debate we are now slowly bringing in industry. I think is a debate that the research community have been very much focused on the importance of human in the loop when you have those powerful algorithms making decisions about people's life. But I think we will need the help of the policymakers to be able to identify those moments that matter, that will assure that each individual is recognized for the value, the skills, the talents they have, and not compare against historical data, because that was the big problem we had with A-level. You award the grades to students based on historical performance of other students that belong or not in their categories, based on how they were categorized. So I think it's very important to recognize that technology has limitation, and it makes sense from a perspective to digitize as much as you can, but we might find ourselves pushing against that for the benefit of preserving and fostering our humanity.
Yeah, I mean, and looking at that underlying data set, and is it representative, or does it contain inherent biases or discrimination that are we going to perpetuate by using that data? Very important. Would you like to come in, Adam?
Yeah, so I think there's always a temptation with technology and digital markets and complexity to think that the normal rules of politics or of ethics or of markets and competition or educational standards, somehow it's so complicated it shouldn't apply. I think my view is that we have the Equality Act, we have Race Relations Act, we have all of the acts which show as a nation where we sit. So it's a matter of applying those same principles to emerging technologies and not fundamentally shifting those principles. I noticed that the Chief Secretary to the Treasury has just arrived, and he will address you shortly, I'm sure. One thing I would observe that in politics and in government, advisors advise, but ministers decide. And I think we're getting to that point now with AI, particularly the example that Raj gives, where we have to say, are humans always going to decide, or are we going to say that the data is reliable enough? Ethical dilemma. If the data is better than humans making the decision, are we in a position where we should allow, in limited circumstances, the AI to decide, even if we don't fully understand how it reached that conclusion? Huge ethical dilemma. But like I say, the government framework with those 5 principles working coordinate across all departments, we should very quickly with the regulators reach a position where we're all in a room discussing, in this particular scenario, how are those principles applied. And I think the example that the situation with your child in school, where there's that inflexibility because we're relying on historic data over a precept. We've got 5 children. I recognise the dilemma. I think I think this is an area where AI may well come to the fore. If we're getting information more quickly, based on the results that are coming through in double quick time, then it may be that then the teacher is in a position to decide, or the head teacher is in a position to decide, or the entire teaching profession is in a position to lobby the government to actually make the system more flexible because we have more data on which to rely.
Right, I think we've maybe got time for one last question, and I'll ask you, Anthony, if you can give us your view. Somebody on the app has asked, which country is doing this the best? Who should the UK seek to emulate? Any thoughts?
My answer is we're doing it the best, and we always will, but I'll let others answer.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I do personally like the progressive approach that the UK is taking at the moment. I think there is a risk that there's kind of sort of reactive over-regulation that's happening. There's a little bit of kind of overreaching from regulators of sort of wanting to increase their power base, and sort of AI is the way to do that. So there's definitely sort of politics at play here. I couldn't really call out which is the best country at the moment because, as I said, none of the new AI regulation has come in yet, so we haven't really had a chance to sort of see how it's been adopted, see how it grows. I think the most seismic effect will be the sort of the EU AI Act, and if we kind of maybe again look at a parallel in terms of what happened with GDPR, I think actually EU GDPR has created a lot of strong data protection standards that other countries have then benefited from. There's still a big divergence between the approach that the US are taking versus the EU. So again, that's going to be something for businesses to really kind of navigate because there will be gaps there.
Well, I share your opinion about saluting the approach we're taking here in the UK. I will want all the countries to be the best because we are in a situation, world is fluid and we are more global than ever. So we need to join forces and share best practices and being able to harmonize those different approaches, because at the end of the day, every single country that is looking to be a top country when it comes to AI wishes to do it safely and ethically and responsibly. Therefore, it makes a lot of sense for us to come together, and we're looking forward to the AI Safety Summit that the UK is going to organize in the fall, but also the common declaration that will be coming from the G7 digital minister that have made a strong commitment. They're looking at this harmonization and leverage best practices around the world, and also recognizing there is a different legal culture in each of those jurisdictions with existing laws and regulation that could be poor. So again, building on the best practices we have and then join forces, I think it's going to be fundamental.
Yep. I think global interoperability across the world is going to be absolutely crucial to getting this right. So please join me in thanking our panelists for their fantastic insights and their time. Thank you all.